Hello everyone, it's Beko here. I'm student at Dokuz University, Faculty of Sport Sciences, and today I will talk to you about effects of mental fatigue on physical performance, which is going to be very exciting. Have you ever heard that your mental state can affect your physical performance even if there is no change in physiological performance parameters like heart rate, lactate accumulation, or oxygen uptake? That is an interesting but also a real fact. And today, my aim is to help you understand what is mental fatigue and how it affects on physical performance parameters. My talk in this presentation is divided into two main chapters. In chapter 1, I will tell you what is mental fatigue, how can we measure mental fatigue, and lastly, how to induce mental fatigue. In chapter 2, I will share with you the most known effect of mental fatigue on physical performance and physiological mechanism of this, experimental design, mental fatigue and age relationship, and how it affects in different training level individuals, and what is happening to aerobic and anaerobic performance parameters in mental fatigue condition. And lastly, I will move on to highlights of my presentation, experimental design of our study. Yes, we are doing a study on this topic in Turkey. It will be published very soon. Today I will share with you just experimental design, participants, and results of our study. So let's get started by defining mental fatigue. Mental fatigue defined as a psychobiological state caused by prolonged periods of demanding cognitive activity. And there are many ways to measure mental fatigue. These methods are providing us subjective, physiological, and cognitive assessment of mental fatigue effects. WAS is the most used method to assess mental fatigue because it's easy to use, takes under 10 seconds to complete. We only ask one question in WAS, and it's how tired do you feel mentally? And to answer this question, participants mark their perceived mental fatigue level according to numbers, and numbers are increasing to the right side, which means more fatigue. The NASA Task Load Index is another tool for measuring subjective mental workload assessment. It rates performance across 6 dimensions to determine an overall workload rating. Let's take a quick look to 6 dimensions. The first one is mental demand, which is the most related one to our topic. We want to see how much thinking, deciding, or calculating was needed to perform the task. The second one is physical demand. It's about the amount and intensity of physical activity needed to complete the task. The third one, temporal demand. What we ask is, how much time pressure did you feel to complete the task? The fourth one, effort. The question is, how hard did you work to maintain your performance during the task? And the next one, performance, it's about self-assessment, the level of success in completing the task. And finally, the last one is frustration level, which we ask is, how insecure, discouraged did you feel during the task? This method was the most used subjective ones, and there are some physiological assessment methods to measure mental fatigue. One of these methods is EEG. Basically, EEG uses multiple tiny electrodes placed on your scalp to measure electrical activity in the brain. Brain cells communicate via electrical impulses and are active all the time. This activity shows up as wave lines on an EEG recording. And the other one is FNIRS. FNIRS is an optical brain monitoring technique which is used for the purpose of functional neuroimaging. Using FNIRS, brain activity measures to estimate hemodynamic activity. And lastly, we have cognitive assessments. These are basically the cognitive tasks. Here's one of the most used cognitive tasks to assess mental fatigue on studies, the flanker test. We measure response time and response inhibition with the flanker test. In this test, there are 3 types of stimuli which you can see on the screen right now. And what we ask from our participants is, just focus on the middle one. It's hard when the middle one and the rest arrows shows to different directions, but with this, we can see the level of response inhibition of our participants related to mental fatigue. So, how useful these methods are? Let's talk about some practical applications. The physiological methods are increase the quality of the data, but because of high cost and movement artifact, this method has low usefulness in the field. On the other hand, subjective and cognitive assessment methods are low in cost and very practical, which makes them highly useful. Researchers usually use a combination of these methods. like subjective plus cognitive assessments, which is the most used form in studies. To induce mental fatigue, most of the studies use cognitive tasks in test batteries such as Pebble and Cantab for 30 to 90 minutes. Especially in the recent times, the most used test is the Stroop color test. Basically, in this test, 4 words, red, blue, green, and yellow, are displayed in a random order on the screen. Participants have to respond to each word according to the color of the word rather than word's meaning. For example, when the word is red but printed in blue ink, the correct answer is blue. Many studies have shown that performing the Stroop test for at least 30 minutes is enough to induce mental fatigue, like I said on the previous page. So the bored but necessary part is over. Now it's time to learn how mental fatigue affects physical performance. The most known effect of mental fatigue on physical performance is higher perceived effort response to the same training load in the mental fatigue condition, which is first proposed by Marcor in 2009. This mechanism shows us physiological explanation to higher perceived effort in mental fatigue condition. As a result of mental fatigue, adenosine, which accumulates in the anterior cingulate cortex, a brain region involved in physical processes such as effort-requiring mental processes and regulation of perceived exertion during exercise, interacts with dopamine and decreases motivation. As a result of this whole physiological process, perceived effort is increasing, and that impairs physical performance output. Here is the experimental design commonly used in studies to investigate the effects of mental fatigue on physical performance. Basically, in the mental fatigue condition, participants does cognitive task plus physical test, while in the control condition, participants does watch a documentary or read a magazine plus physical test. And it's important to say that this studies has crossover design. Crossover designs allow the response of participants to experimental treatment to be compared with the same participants' response to control treatment. So in a nutshell, it means if you have 20 participants in your study, you have 20 participants in both the mental fatigue and the control condition. Studies have shown that in all age groups under the mental fatigue condition, physical performance is impaired. But there is one study in addition to these studies which says younger individuals might be less negatively affected by mental fatigue than older ones. In this study, 3 different age groups were examined with the same experimental design, and that was what they found. But there is one problem about this study, and that is the age groups studied are very close to each other. One group is under 14, second group is under 16, and the last one is under 18. It would have been very exciting if this study had been done for example, 13, 25, and 37 age groups instead of under 14, under 16, and under 18 players. So what about different training levels? There is just one specific study to compare how mental fatigue affects on physical performance in different training level individuals, published by Martin in 2016. In this study, professional and recreational cyclists compared in the same experimental design, and what they found is while the performance output of recreational cyclists decreased in the mental fatigue condition, there was no change in professionals. But later, a study published by Venice in 2017 showed that physical performance impaired in the mental fatigue condition in elite cricket players. So, according to these different findings, we can say this topic is complicated and of course need more research. Unlike the relationship between different training levels and mental fatigue, the relationship between aerobic performance and mental fatigue is very clear. Most of the studies about this topic have common findings, and that is, in the mental fatigue condition, even if there is no change in physiological parameters, which is traditionally believed to limit endurance performance, such as heart rate, lactate accumulation, and oxygen uptake, there is an impairment in aerobic performance mediated by higher perceived effort response to the same training load. There are some different types of endurance tests used in studies. Basically, power output or running speed is determined by the researchers in the constant load tests and by the participants in the self-paced tests. And in mental fatigue condition, what we see in this test is a decrease in time to exhaustion or an increase in completion time caused by a decrease in self-paced velocity or power and a decrease in a distance covered. Limited studies examining the effect of mental fatigue on some of the anaerobic performance parameters like explosive power, sprint, agility, and anaerobic work capacity shows us that mental fatigue has no effect on anaerobic performance. So, in the mental fatigue condition, anaerobic performance stays the same, but there's an impairment in aerobic performance. Why? To answer this question, we can say submaximal aerobic exercises are regulated by brain. On the other hand, maximal anaerobic exercises are regulated by muscular mechanisms. So there is less cognitive component in anaerobic exercise, and that's why mental fatigue influences anaerobic performance less. But it is still the biggest question in this topic, and of course we need more research to make this clear. Highlights of my presentation. What did we learn? What were the key points? The most used assessment methods are subjective and cognitive ones because these methods are low in cost and very practical. 30 to 90 minutes of cognitive tasks are used to induce mental fatigue, especially the Stroop color test. In all age groups, under the mental fatigue condition, physical performance is impaired. And there was one study which says younger players might be less negatively affected by mental fatigue than older ones, but because of the limitation of this study, the age groups was so close to each other, this idea is still unclear and need more research. The effect of mental fatigue on the physical performance of individuals with different training levels is still unclear too. The most permanent finding in studies to date is the higher perceived effort response to the same training load in the mental fatigue condition, and RPA, rating of perceived exertion, is increasing in mental fatigue condition because of the accumulation of adenosine in the brain, which causes lower dopamine and motivation levels. While there is an impairment in aerobic performance in mental fatigue condition, there is no change in anaerobic performance because aerobic exercises are regulated by the brain and anaerobic exercises are regulated by muscular mechanisms. So this is our experimental design. Firstly, baseline subjective and cognitive measurements, plus cognitive task or watching documentary. After that, subjective and cognitive measurements again to see mental fatigue and documentary effect. Depends on condition. Physical test, and lastly, subjective and cognitive measurements again, but this time to see whole process. Our participants was adolescent soccer and taekwondo athletes, and what we found is mental fatigue participants covered less total distance in endurance test compared to the contrary condition. So that's it. Thanks for your attention. For questions and comments, you can contact me anytime.